America is the largest aircraft manufacturer in the world, home to famous companies such as Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Cessna, Gulfstream, Sikorsky, McDonnell Douglas, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Icon, Cirrus, Beechcraft and Piper, amongst many, many others. And while America has a great interest in civil aviation, it's no secret that its military is one of the most overfunded in the world. While that is its own issue, it's certainly spawned a lot of aircraft. From the famous Tomcats, Vipers and Raptors, down to lesser known airframes such as the Demon and Thunderstreak. But not every aircraft thought up by their engineers ended up entering service, undergoing trials, or even left the drawing board. Today we'll be taking a look at the X-planes of America, from the very first groundbreaking designs to advanced future concepts. But what is an X-plane though? The United States Department of Defense uses a system of letters to give aircraft their designations. Aircraft within the DoD tend to have their names structured like this, with the status first, mission second, and number last. Many of the planes you will see have just the mission and number, such as the FA-18, A-10, C-17 and F-35, but some will have a status letter in front of them. The ones we're interested in are X and Y, X standing for experimental and Y standing for prototype. This is an important distinction, as X planes typically aren't intended to go into production, whereas Y planes are. Examples of Y planes include the YF-16 and the YF-23. An exception to this rule are the planes of the Joint Strike Fighter program, the X-32 and X-35, which in theory should have been named the YF-23 and 35, as they were prototypes for aircraft intended to go into production, but were given the X designation because, I don't know, sounds cooler? Before we get into that though, let's take a look at where X-planes began, with a few oddballs along the way. The first plane to sport the X mission prefix is of course the X-1, and it immediately made an impression by being the first aircraft to cross the sound barrier, reaching 800 miles per hour in 1947. To assist the X-1 and avoid the need for excess fuel to take off, the aircraft was attached to the underside of a B-29 Superfortress and dropped at 29,000 feet. It would then ascend to 35,000 feet using its rocket motor. It would then reach its top speed before gliding back down to land on an airfield. Its first flight was performed by arguably one of the most important pilots of all time, Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, and in his orange X-1 named Glamorous Glennis, he became the first ever person to break the sound barrier. The next aircraft, or rather spaceplane, followed a very similar launch method to the X-1, but would propel itself above the Kármán line using suborbital hypersonic trajectory. The X-15 was an improvement on the X-1 in every way, being way faster and having the ability to briefly enter space. The launch vehicle was also improved to a B-52 Stratofortress, which could then launch the X-15 at a height of 45,000 feet. The engine was improved to a single liquid fuel rocket motor, which sped the X-15 up to 2,800 miles per hour over the course of 2 minutes. At its max service ceiling of about 67 miles, there was no air for the control surfaces to act against. To overcome this, the X-15 was equipped with a reaction control system that used cold gas to push the aircraft in the vacuum of space, maintaining control authority despite the lack of any aerodynamic control. The X-15 would then glide down to the ground in a similar manner to the X-1, although it was a lot more difficult to control at low speed due to its stubby wings that produced little lift. On final approach, the X-15 would eject the vertical stabilizer on its underside to allow for enough clearance for the landing gear. The X-15 program was not without its tragedy, however, as test pilot Michael Adams would be killed after his X-15 entered a spin at over Mach 5, causing it to break up at 10 minutes and 35 seconds after launch. This killed him instantly. A lot of aircraft can lend their success to this one, such as the F-14 Tomcat, Tornado and the MiG-23 Flogger, although I wouldn't exactly call that one a success. This is the Bell X-5, a 1951 attempt at the concept of variable geometry wings. The X-5 was inspired by the Messerschmitt P1101 prototype, a German jet fighter that could have its wing sweep angle changed before flight. This prototype was delivered to Bell shortly after the war, and they improved upon it by giving the X-5 the option to change its wing sweep in flight, with a choice of 20, 40 and 60 degree sweep angles. The ability to sweep the wings was important for a number of reasons. It can allow excellent low-speed handling when swept forward, but can then be swept backwards to optimise the aircraft for high speeds, moving the centre of lift rearwards. Swept wings are also advantageous for naval aircraft, as they can be stored with the wings fully back to take up less space in the carrier. Variable geometry wings began to fall out of favour after fly-by-wire systems and advancements in aerodynamics made them obsolete, alongside them being an absolute nightmare for ground technicians to work on. VTOL aircraft have been popular ever since the dawn of the Harrier and developed further into the Yak-141 and the F-35B. However, the road to these aircraft was not a smooth one, with many attempts to create VTOL aircraft before settling on rotating nozzles and lift fans. An example of this is the X-13 Vertijet, which had a unique way of taking off. It would take off vertically, with its nose pointed towards the sky, and once it had built up enough speed, it would pitch down and transition into standard flight. And if that wasn't terrifying enough, the X-13 could then land again vertically, and the pilot would be effectively trying to land a plane backwards. This ended up being a dead end for VTOL aircraft, but it was a key step in discovering what works. Carrying on the theme of VTOL aircraft, the X-22 was an interesting experiment into the field of using ducted fans as a primary lifting force for an aircraft. Despite the visual similarities in name, this wasn't directly related to the actual V-22 Osprey, which used two large turbofans to take off vertically and transition into vertical flight using wings. The X-22's ducted fans were powered by 4 small gas turbine engines that could propel it up to 300 miles an hour. If the variable geometry wings of the X-5 were a departure from the norm, then its next aircraft is even stranger. The X-29 was an experiment into the idea of forward-swept wings in aircraft. This was not a new concept, and another late-war German aircraft called the Junkers Ju-287 is a famous example of a flying prototype that used forward-swept wings. Sweeping the wings forward on an aircraft produces a number of unique properties, such as moving the wing roots back for more space in the fuselage while keeping the centre of pressure the same. But the main advantage is the different stall and transonic flight characteristics. A standard aircraft will begin to stall at the wingtips, which renders the ailerons useless, but the forward-swept wings will cause the wing to begin stalling at the roots, ensuring the ailerons remain fully functional. A similar effect also takes place during transonic flight, as the ailerons won't lock up under highly compressed airflow. The X-29 was created using the front fuselage of an F-5 attached to a fully custom rear fuselage with carbon fibre elements. It would make its first flight in December of 1984 and would be the first aircraft with forward-swept wings to break the sound barrier. It proved to be incredibly manoeuvrable, and the Phase 2 upgrade could pull up to 45 degrees of AOA, with even up to 67 degrees being possible with diminished manoeuvrability. The X-29 went on to inspire the Su-47 Bokut, a technology demonstrator that also explored forward-swept wings and made use of a number of components from the Su-27. Forward-swept wings were made obsolete in part due to advancements in thrust vectoring, which provided far greater performance with standard-shaped wings. I think it's a shame that forward-swept wings never really took off, purely from an aesthetic standpoint. There's not really anything else like the X-29 and the Su-47 out there. The final X-plane I want to talk about before the JSF aircraft isn't really a plane and is by far the strangest looking one I've covered. The X-49 Speedhawk is a modified UH-60 Blackhawk that turns it into a compound helicopter. This is a type of aircraft that aims to circumvent the speed limitations of standard helicopters by attaching wings and props. This way it had similar flight performance to a plane, but retains the hovering capability of a helicopter. By making use of a ducted fan at the rear and a set of wings, the X-49 could propel itself to a maximum speed of 220 miles an hour. The wings would provide much of the lift in forward flight, meaning the main rotor could be slowed down to reduce drag. The X-49 would only be tested for a short period of time, and it hasn't been used since about 2008. The last plane in this video was a product of a contract set out by the US Department of Defense called the Joint Strike Fighter Program. This entailed finding a replacement for the majority of America and its allies' existing airframes, including the A-10, F-18, F-16, Aviate/Harrier, and Tornado. The JSF would require stealth, supersonic, and multi-role capability. 3 variants would also be needed: an Air Force model that would have been a pretty standard 5th generation multi-role fighter to replace the A-10 and F-16, a naval version with larger wings and beefed up landing gear to replace the F-18, and a VTOL variant for use on smaller vessels, finally phasing out the subsonic Aviate platform in use by the Marines. 4 manufacturers would take up the contract, but Boeing and Lockheed Martin would win the $750 million grant to build their flying prototypes, 1 conventional aircraft and 1 VTOL each. Lockheed Martin would put forward the X-35B and X-35C, the VTOL and carrier models respectively, and as you probably know already, this would go on to win the JSF contest and became the F-35 Lightning II, which has had its own set of controversies it would be far too long for me to discuss right now, and has already been covered to death by other YouTubers and news outlets. However, on the other side of this competition was Boeing's offering, the X-32, a smaller delta-winged fighter with a 2D thrust vectoring nozzle. Like the X-35, it featured internal weapons bays to maintain its stealth characteristics and could carry up to 6 missiles internally. This is where the similarities end, as the X-32 had a quite different and obvious design choice from the X-35. That giant gob on the front was the air intake. The logic behind it is that it could take in far more air to power its Harrier-style VTOL system. It could also scare the enemy so much that they couldn't look at the X-32, granting extra stealthiness. It had two major flaws, however. When in VTOL mode, the intake would suck in hot air from the exhaust nozzles, reducing the efficiency of the engine and leading to overheating. It would also compromise the stealth characteristics of the plane, as the blades of the engine were visible from the front, which reflects an enormous amount of radar waves. The F-22 and F-35 get around this by using S-ducts, which hide the blades of the engine from the front. The Russian Su-57 Felon has a similar problem to this, but used it to his advantage, creating such a huge radar return that it gets filtered out as ground clutter. On its first flight, the X-32 proved to be a competent aircraft, was reported as going so fast that the chasing F-18 struggled to keep up with it, even on full afterburner. After testing for the X-32 and 35 concluded, Boeing proposed an improved model that fixed most of the serious issues, including a smaller front intake and adding elevators at the back, replacing the delta wing design with a more conventional layout. This improved version resembles a sort of stealth F-86 in a way, but I don't think it's a bad looking aircraft at all, especially compared to the original design. In the end, the X-32 won out due to its lift fan system performing far better than the nozzle system of the X-32, and the F-35B would officially enter service with the United States Marine Corps in 2015, followed shortly by the A and C variants. As of the making of this video, over 1,000 F-35s have been built, and it's proven to be one of the most dominant fighter jets in the world. What happened to the X-32? After the F-35 won out, the X-32 became a developmental dead end, and both prototypes were relegated to museums in the mid-2000s. If you want to see them for yourself and bask in the glory of its giant mouth, you can find the X-32 in the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, next to the YF-23 Black Widow, the plane that lost to the F-22 Raptor in its own design competition. The X-32B resides at the Patuxent River National Air Museum, but has since been left to rot in an outside exhibition. Despite these planes' hideous appearance, it's a shame it's not being better taken care of, as it's undoubtedly an important part of modern aviation history. So, I think I've covered everything I want to talk about with these weird and wonderful aircraft of the X-Plane series. I hope you've learned something new at least, and maybe found a new appreciation for Boeing's ugly duckling. I apologise if you've been waiting a while for me to release this new video, but I'm going to try and spend more time working on these videos. If you're new here, dropping a like and subscribing to the channel would be a massive help, and feel free to check out my previous video on the Typhoon and its history. I've got an interesting and relevant topic lined up next, so be on the lookout for that. Until next time, fly safe.